All right, hello everybody, and welcome to Golden Thread Podcast. I'm Alan Cowley. We've got Dr. Dylan Odner and Mike Thomas here as usual, and we're here today to talk about memory and the Labyrinth. The memory side of it is, I think, so much of our life experience is actually tied up in memory. Whether we talk about having a good memory or a bad memory, good memories and bad memories, or anything of the sort. When we're in the Labyrinth, for instance, I tend to remember a lot of things. Some things that I haven't remembered in many years. Some things that I didn't even know I had to remember. Things will get drawn up and I'll just go, whoa, where did that come from? So there's definitely a connection between, of course, walking labyrinths and meditation and the memory. So I think we're here to talk a little bit about what the memory is, how we experience it, how it's involved in our experience of life, of the challenges of life, of trauma, the experience of rising out and becoming who we really, can become. So let's just jump right into one of the things I've been thinking about is how much a labyrinth looks like a brain, and this one in particular that we've been working on is a quote from Joseph Campbell from Hero from a Thousand Faces, and so
I think this one's actually not from here.
Oh, it's not?
No, I think it's from the Power of Myth talk with, we'll continue on that. But yeah, Mike, I think you were the one that sort of wanted to tackle this particular term, implicit memory. The concept of memory, as you already said, Alan, is so wide, right? So much of our experience from moment to moment is memory. You see little kids constantly starting to break through a sort of out of the Garden of Eden moment where they're starting to wonder, are the memories I have of my childhood, I know this is a complicated concept, but are the memories I have from my own childhood actual memories, or are they me remembering being told about it and it forming a memory for me? And at a certain, in that, we emerge from our childhood that we can't remember in this slow sort of way, this murky way, whereby it's not all at once. Oh, the recording button is now turned on, and suddenly, oh, what was your earliest memory? That therefore from then on you remember. That's not how life works in any way. So it's kind of a little bit of an illusion that it's any different than that for us. When we say, oh, we've got these memories, oh, I remember that or I don't, that's kind of an illusion. Actually, the replaying of that memory, the repetition, which is going to be a theme for today, may be what is formed. It's a creation after the fact. So much so that when, from a Freudian or a Jungian perspective, when you do dream analysis, there's sort of this concept that the dream is not just comprised of what really happened. Like, what does that even mean? What you really dreamed. It's equally or even more so about the dream work, the dream fabric that you create as you're taking things from a different world that isn't tactile and grabbing onto associations as you wake and forming something for your memory to hold on to.
I've recently heard, and I haven't done the research myself after hearing this, but this person I know well, that's my mom, was telling me, hey, have you heard this really cool thing about the memory? And what she was telling me is that pretty much every time we remember something, it's rewriting, and so it's recreating that memory to begin with. So it's kind of like our remembering something is actually only remembering the last occurrence of remembering it. And so you think about a copy of a copy of a copy,
which also confirms and deepens the grooves of that memory, right? By going over it. So all of memory, which is what we're going to be talking about, is repetition. It's no different, I would argue, and I'll pass it over to you here, from muscle memory. When you're talking about, oh, how do you get good at free throws? Well, the answer for me is you don't. But but in this case, what we mean is through repetition until you're not thinking about the memory or the particular, physics of how you're going to arc this. No, you're going to allow the memory and the grooves that have been well worn through a pilgrimage of musculature. It's going to form this process.
So I like the points that you both brought up about memory. I would say that it's a funny thing because memory itself is perception. It's a habit of perception. It's neurological function broken into different parts. And what I mean by that is when you talked about muscle memory, you might think of it as body memory. It's known as procedural memory in the scientific world. It's what the body remembers on a feeling and behavioral level. So I mean feelings in terms of emotions, but on a deeper level, sensations. So anytime something happens, we unconsciously, mostly, and a little bit of that, tiny fraction of that is a conscious recording, you might say. And so the parts that are conscious are called explicit memory, and the parts that are unconscious are called implicit memory. And it's important to distinguish between the two because we can record implicit memory, and we always are. No matter whether we're awake or we're sleeping, we're constantly recording, if you will, the neurological pathways of our sensations, picking up all the input that's coming in. I think it's been measured around 2 million bits per second. Bit is a half of a computer byte. So if that's coming in unconsciously, 2 million bits per second, and the conscious portion of that is 126 bits per second. It's just a tiny fraction of what we're experiencing. Why is this important? I mean, that's, fun, nerd speak for, like, okay, what's exactly happening here? But it's important to you because when your body records something at a body level and it doesn't record it in an explicit way, you're going to have behaviors and feelings and experiences that won't make sense in the present moment. You're going to experience things that might be like, why in the world is my body doing this? Why is my digestion not happening correctly? Why am I feeling anxious and nothing is threatening me right now? Why am I feeling depressed? Or, why are my hands feeling numb?
Yeah.
Earlier today, you were just mentioning how, you have this experience when anxiety is higher and your hands get
Raynaud's syndrome.
Raynaud's syndrome? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I saw it when you walked in. They were white compared to the rest of your hands.
Yeah.
And
so
only
in that case, only 7 out of my 8 digits, not counting thumbs. Sometimes it's random. Sometimes it's a sharp line across like that. Very interesting.
It's fascinating. And it's the body communicating something that we don't have conscious awareness of. So getting back to that idea of memory being habit of perception, this is kind of a fun topic to unpack. But where it means a lot in your life is when something is really positive and you're feeling really good. For whatever reason, the cues in the environment, your senses are taking in something that reminds you on an unconscious level of something good.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you're just in a good mood. You don't know why. But that also applies to trauma. And in particular, with trauma, because of the level of fear there, the explicit memory that's recorded in the hippocampus gets cut off. So instead, the deeper parts of the brain, like the amygdala, which control the fear response, that stays online. And if something really traumatic happens, the hippocampus shuts down with enough cortisol, with enough stress, with enough fear, right? And when that happens, instead of recording the memory explicitly, where we could recall that memory, instead, that part's deleted, and we just get the fear response in the body and in the emotions and in our behavior. So if you think of like a veteran that's come back from war and has, he or she has dealt with bombs going off and a car backfires when they're back here after they've been in war, and they just drop to the ground like a bomb's going off. If you talk to them, chances are they'll know that a bomb hasn't gone off. Right. Their body did that. Their body had them do that behavior to protect them.
And I think there's we're making too much of a sharp disconnect between consciously knowing. They can tell you, but it's not just, oh, my body did that. There's a whole symphony, what was the term we were using? A complex, right? Yeah. Of smells and feelings that are being triggered incorrectly, you could argue, but there's obviously some connection there.
Yeah.
And I think we often focus on that, the I guess the harsh effects or the ways that we notice. You bring up PTSD symptoms for soldiers and things like that. Here's another way to know that what you said is true. Marketing.
Yes.
If you go into Disney, there's a reason why it smells the way it smells. When you walk down that main entrance, it's going to smell of bread, homemade bread, and a little bit of sweetness and sugar, cotton candy. They purposefully pipe smells in. They purposefully put, we go back to the sound motif, that there's that. All of the sounds that you hear, they specifically try to create memory in every way, smell being the most powerful of those.
The most direct.
Most direct.
Yeah.
So they actually pump in smells to bring up, hopefully, childhood memories or memories that, homemade baked bread, so good. Sweetness. And they want you to feel happy from the moment you walk in because they're trying to make you come back. So if we can think about not just stemming off the bad problems, but how do we create environments where we're inviting ourselves into the happiness by cueing ourselves in a positive way. I wonder about that too.
Yeah.
Which, in the case of marketing, could be a bit of a manipulative experience. Because yes, it's positive, but do we really want to be buying all those things that we're probably cued to buy? Maybe not. And so, there's a bit of negative manipulation going on with that positive association.
Right.
So, setting up a habit of perception in our lives that allows us to build positive associations with things that help us grow, that help us connect with ourselves, with one another, arguably is what we're aiming for as far as working with implicit memory in a positive way, which brings us to the Labyrinth, of course.
Yes. And that is going to be a main focus today. There's something so, at least it's obvious to us who have been talking about it so much, but left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot, you're walking through a process that I think it is nostalgia, just like that Disney World experience, but it's a nostalgia unattached to specificity. It's a form that is opening from a trauma perspective. It's relaxing all of those. It's a comforting, just like being wrapped in a feminine hug would naturally bring you back to your childhood when you were more receptive to new ideas in a safer place, hopefully. I think it does the same thing with a Labyrinth where you are being coaxed, you are being rocked to the toward the world navel at the center of this. And talk about implicit. This is not explicit stuff going on, but we are so wildly intelligent beings on an implicit level. I don't want to get too far into this, but here we are recording a podcast, and how often do we think of technology as being wildly impressive and too much, almost exponential, because we've got this input for visual and this input for sound and that input for sound and visual, and then we have light, outputs. That is 6 components. And who would believe that with the technology we have now, that if we could combine these perfectly and sync them up just right, it would be as though you are here having this conversation. We hope you have that experience with this podcast, but we know it's not the case. So the only way to get anywhere close is through this mind-body connection practices, and the Labyrinth is just one of those. And it's so archetypal, it's so basic that it's triggering all these implicit actions, so that we talked last week with Jackie about people bursting into tears when they walk a labyrinth. And this isn't the only ritual process that does that, but that's because it's engaging and allowing all those implicit actions to be utilized, right? Very briefly, we have trillions of input vessels, right? It's interesting that we think of it as, oh, 2 cameras here and 2 smellers, but then lots of toucher. That's obviously not the case. We have a flood of things, and we purposefully, I believe, cannot distinguish taste from smell in a clear way. Those two are so deeply connected, but I think they're all deeply connected. And when you're sitting in this chair, we've heard from biology classes that if you were explicitly receiving all of the comfort and discomfort of your butt touching the chair constantly, just that would drive the person insane within minutes, right?
Yeah.
So you have to, that hippocampus has to be able to be shut down.
So this brings up another aspect of memory in 2 ways, because you bring up the technology. So I'm thinking that you've got storage kinds of memory, and then you've got working RAM memory. So we have a certain amount, which is our capacity for operating. How many things can I keep going at once? I can keep this hand going there and rubbing my belly at once.
Yeah.
And, okay, can I switch that around? I don't know, right now I can't. Because I'm thinking about something at the same time. Who knows? How many things can we keep going? There's an operating RAM memory that we have that's different, but it draws upon all of the other memory that we have as efficiently as it can in the moment. So if we've kind of created those grooves previously through experience, through reinforcement, then we've kind of got easy access. So when we're in the moment and something is, we call it second nature, it doesn't take a lot of operational memory to just grab, that's that. But when it's new to us, it's like we really have to think about it. And I get experience this most with learning new songs and music. I play a lot of music, and I've been surprised lately because I've been trying to embrace being a bassist. I know I'm allowed to say that publicly. Yep. As a guitar player, it's always been one of those things, not enough bassists around, so people shove a bass in your hand if you can. So I've reluctantly done it for years. I've been embracing it in a way now where it's like new songs are very challenging at first. And it's so fascinating how quickly, almost as soon as I pick up a new song to learn the next one, the old one becomes muscle memory.
Yeah.
And so I started playing a song that I was challenged by just 2 weeks ago and didn't think that I had taken that next step. But all of a sudden I was thrown into the moment where I didn't think we were going to practice it together. And I was like, oh no, I haven't done that in weeks. And my fingers just took it. Wow. So it's kind of cool how repetition matters. It didn't take a whole lot of operational memory to just play, as opposed to when I was first learning it, it's like 3, 5, 7, very mechanical.
Wow. I wanted to jump in here. I wrote a paper during my PhD program during a ritual class, and there was a cue for this, or a prompt for this particular paper, and that was dealing with repetition and the importance of repetition in ritual. So I wrote a paper a very short one called the Neuro-Pilgrimage. So I want to bring in this concept of pilgrimage. I've said before, it's becoming a bit of a mantra for me that a labyrinth is a pilgrimage wrapped up into a ball for your convenience. Another different way that I said it, I guess last week, is that a labyrinth is as much sacred space as you can fit, squeezed into, in an orderly fashion, squeezed into a small area. So the paper I wrote was pretty simple. It was an active metaphor between what a religious pilgrimage is and does, the acts of repeating as a group and as an individual a thing through memory, from the past, to retrace the steps of a past event, for transformation that happens right now. Comparing that on that level to what is happening on a micro level or on a neuro level. The neuro pilgrimage that happens every time you remember something. That happens when you remember something good and you reinforce that. You take that same the neurons take that same pilgrimage through the brain matter. I'm simplifying things because I don't even understand it. That same pathway, right? In a positive way. Oh, my parents love me. Oh, my parents love me. In equal parts, the negative pilgrimages we take. Oh, nobody at school actually cares about me. Oh, now I'm remembering that time when I got pantsed at school, and it's wearing that in, and how the more times we do that, go through that pilgrimage, the more ingrained it is, and the more it brings up trauma, memory, all those
re-traumatization,
right,
by repeating it.
Exactly. So that was the metaphor. I'm sure I'm not the first person to have made this connection, but what I wanted to do was read. This is from Edith Turner. Her overview of ritualistic pilgrimage in the Encyclopedia of Religion. So here she's just doing a fictionalized generalization of what a pilgrimage is. Once in a place apart, there appeared a very holy person. Miracles occurred at that place and drew multitudes of pilgrims. Later, a shrine was built by devotees. Now, in the present, those who are afflicted make a promise to the holy person in their hearts. If you help me, I will make the journey to your shrine and perform devotions there. Okay, how is that any different from the promise you make to this positive or negative memory of the past? If you stay with me, I will show devotion, retread these steps. So whether that is the Mecca, the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca for Muslims, or visiting the Bodhi tree where the Buddha gained his enlightenment, right? Christ's journey to Calvary. These different pilgrimages are an outward collective version of what we do on an internal level every time we bring up sensation, memory, etc.
Would you suggest that through rituals like walking labyrinths in particular, and I think it almost just has all of the components of physically representing what I'm about to say, which is that you're almost rewriting. It looks like you're writing a record and just putting the grooves into the ground by your walking, but that simultaneously you're allowing space for neural plasticity. It's like purposely going, I'm going to soften this spot in my brain by bringing up those memories, perhaps, that I have a hard time figuring out the connection between my body and that, or that memory just haunts me, or something along those lines. If I want to work on that, bringing it up in my mind and doing something that's different and sacred and purposeful might help us rewrite some of it, I would imagine.
Yes, I can speak to that directly.
Yeah,
so
please.
The healing process involves allowing implicit memories that are unpleasant from traumatic experiences in the past, if we're talking about healing trauma. As you're re-experiencing them, getting present to your sensations and the environment now, that it's safe now. Most importantly, in relationship, because trauma doesn't get stuck in the body from those negative experiences unless we are isolated and not able to be supported by someone with whom we're in an attachment relationship with. The attachment bond is so valuable, and I could go really deep into early human development, maybe we will later in the conversation, but it's about going through the ritual of being present to your senses through some sort of practice, like walking through a labyrinth, where you're present to this moment now, that it's safe, that it's different than the internal experience that's coming up from that negative traumatic experience that the body keeps bringing up as fear, anxiety, digestive issues, low self-esteem, emotional roller coasters where we go up and down and we're like, why am I just all over the place? These implicit experiences, these implicit memories, we can actually rewrite them through repetition, through ritual, through practice of being in the present moment, but we have to repeat it to make sure the body gets on that deep implicit level. It's safe now. It's safe now. Kind of like that scene in Good Will Hunting. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. That it was an experience of rewriting that experience for him, which is why it was so powerful and so many people relate to it so deeply. You feel that scene when he keeps repeating it and he's trying to brush him off, and then he finally breaks down into tears. He's
the first few times, we're ready for repetition of a certain level that we can still stave off that transformation. But at a certain point, it does break through. I think you were wanting to...
I was, but then it slipped because I was like, let me switch over here.
So that brings up something for me. Why do we need to pilgrimage? Why do we need to go to the labyrinth? On the positive side of things, it's because the present moment is so great for forming implicit memory. But not so great because you're present. It's really wonderful. If it's something really, my wife and I going on a lovely vacation, we hope we aren't spending too much RAM on forming conscious, explicit memory and missing out on the present. So that's why we mythologize, we pilgrimage, right? We go through, we replay those memories, forming them deeper. And on the negative side, unfortunately, that is where the implicit is just being built up in this structure. And we think it's such vivid, explicit memory too. Again, let's talk, instead of the individual, let's talk about so many of the events that form a pilgrimage are Thomas à Becket getting his skull caved in or they're negative, traumatic, horrific events where a collective miracle happens. But I just wanted to say that it's like, they're vivid, but they're imprecise, and it is...
Well, I'm glad you brought up what you're sharing about your wife there, because I think that often, thinking about it in relationships, I know in my experience of a relationship, we can get tied up in trying to figure out the explicit problems that we have in our, we'll talk through problems, but we find that we trigger each other because we have so many memories of problems from each other. To be honest, we've had some issues over the 18 years we've been together. Surprise. And guess what? I'm more in love now than ever, but that doesn't mean you don't go through challenges. And one of the things that is making me think of is there's a use in having conversations and trying to have that rational, figure it out. But there's also the creation of new implicit memories that I think we can leave out, because I can get too tied up in wanting to have a solution come to mind where we can then make a plan and then act it. Whereas it might be better to just go, let's stop trying to figure this out right now. Let's go watch a movie together.
Let's walk a labyrinth together.
Let's walk a labyrinth together. There's a lot of safe space that we have together. Let's just go to one of those places and reinforce those things in our relationship rather.
Yeah, can I feel like I've been talking too much, but what I want to say is just that just as the present moment isn't great, I believe, on a neurological level, on a memory level, of taking in explicit memory, which is so almost ironic, right? It's only with the re-mythologization that happens after. But another thing would be that dealing with explicit, this is exactly what you're saying, dealing with implicit problems, it doesn't happen on your time scale.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's what you're saying, is that now isn't the time to, unless you're a therapist, or sometimes you need to face those things a little bit, but you are, in mythological terms, that's trying to drag mythos into the light, into the harsh light of day, and saying, what do you mean? What does mythology mean? It doesn't work, and that's why it needs to stay in the cool shade of hey, we're going to deal with this slowly. We're gonna deal with it a bit at a time, and quite frankly, allow each of us to deal with it on our own.
Because we all know that there are certain ways we can tell somebody we love them, but the reality of that feeling, or the reality of that whatever love is inexpressible.
Right.
So there's a dissonance, or there's something lacking from the explicit that is in the implicit.
There's so I have some training in this this tool called NLP, stands for Neuro Linguistic Programming.
Yeah.
And the gist of it is that the words we use have deeper meanings. They're implicit in terms of the associations we have with them, and so you can use words in a particular way that sort of like a lock and key trigger old memories or recreate them in a way where our associations are different. So for example, I retrained my brain to associate the sound of a particular alarm on my clock, which brought up these feelings of dread, like, oh God, at the time I had a really difficult day ahead of me, and just that's what my association was. It wasn't fun. And I switched the association with that sound to the feelings I had when I was a kid, around 8 years old on Christmas morning. And so in NLP, you can use these procedures to retrain your association with certain sensory experiences, like the alarm clock, to be a positive thing instead of a negative thing. It's called the swish pattern, because every time you repeat this process, you say swish, and you associate swish with the changing. Anyway, so the alarm would go off, and this association stayed strong for years. Every time I would hear it, and still when I hear that, I get these butterflies in my stomach, like, oh, what my present's going to be? It was that same feeling, but it wasn't the actual memory. It was just the feeling that I had in those memories, right?
So I have a question about that, and I don't think it doesn't relate to Labyrinth. But can you go too far with that as a bait and switch? If you can you set yourself up for future trauma by using these conscious skills we've gained? We've become enlightened to have some control, maybe, and understanding of the functions that lead to memory formation.
Yes. Oh, it's a slippery slope.
Right.
I was about to say, go back to the marketing that we were talking about earlier, and you can have
Right.
very positive marketing that's actually selling a good product that's good for you, but then you can have long-term manipulative stuff that we just never notice. And we have a society that perhaps
is worse off for it.
Afraid of everything. I don't know where they would live if that was the place, but
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I can give you a specific example of, in a deeper level of that training, we call it master practitioner training of NLP, which includes hypnosis and all sorts of cool tools to understand how the unconscious works and how to work with it. So a simple, changing of association, like the swish pattern I described, is kind of like, it's like an appetizer. It's like a taster to give you a sense of, okay, there is some agency here. Whereas before I used to think, well, whatever my association is, I'm stuck with it. Right. At a deeper level, there are actually procedures that are designed to support looking at what your values are in life. And there's a hierarchy of values, unconscious values, that guide your behavior. And you can get a sense of those and figure those out. There's a whole process for discovering that. Now, there is an ethics to NLP where, in this particular instance, I'm talking about changing values. If you change someone's top 3 values to be money, for example, over how they value their family, they'll abandon their family and leave to go take a job across the country so they can make more money because you've switched their values. That's unethical in terms of the way you can use that tool. And it can totally cause trauma.
Right. It could be a tool for a cult. I mean, that's probably implicitly what the cult personality, the cult leader, charismatic leader is capable of, has always been capable of. They didn't put it in those terms, but they had the ability to, through repetition and through an understanding of timeliness and when those new inputs need to come in, say, every time, oh, I know you naturally think that affection should go towards your family, but actually we are the family structure, for example.
Sure.
Well, this is actually very much how Montessori seems to function as well. The guides or the teachers in the classroom, but so much of their job is observation, and they have very specific things that they're paying attention to for mastery of specific things, and they know exactly what the next thing is that they're going to introduce, because it's all kind of aligned in a pattern or in a chain that introduces you deeper and deeper into something. And so it's kind of a known way of kind of leading you on in a good way to learn about your environment and about the universe. So it's exactly, I think that's what education is all about.
For sure.
It's trying to find what are those things that actually make us want to learn and learn better for ourselves. I think thinking about this the way I've been using explicit and implicit, I think that there's a way that education can get too over-focused on the test. Do you know the answers?
Yeah.
And loses track of, do you understand the information? And it's, I think, a similar challenge.
Yeah, that's the teacher falling for their own trick. Like, we have to constantly, you have to create a mythology for the school that tests matter and that exams will matter and that grades matter. But if you sit down with any teacher, at least any responsible teacher, they'll tell you the test is not the thing, right? But it is easy as an educator to fall into your own traps and start feeling angry that your students aren't remembering, what date in 1066, right? It's obviously not what's important. You're trying to build a framework for learning future things learning things in the future. So I did want to say education is
going earlier. I wanted to go and throw it back to you, Mike, because you shared a video for Wellness Wednesdays about the implicit memory, and particularly that first 18 months of life that he was speaking of. And there are so many elements of that video brought up question marks about how much we don't choose about our implicit memories that are so the timing of them in terms of our impressionability. At 0 to 18 months, the amount of change that's going on in an infant's brain is insane compared to adults. You've shared on that before. I think it was like 20,000 neurons versus hundreds, something like that kind
10,000 to 20,000 neurons per second turning over in infancy in that period versus adulthood, a couple hundred a day.
Yeah.
We're talking a second for tens of thousands versus a couple hundred a day. It's like, what a scale difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe you could speak a little bit to, we were talking a little bit about that time period, and I know it doesn't really relate to Labyrinth walking because they're not walking yet. But in terms of what we're talking about today with memory and implicit memories that are formed that we will later probably have to unravel and rewrite in a labyrinth.
So
let's jump into this.
I love this topic so much. So this is what drives a lot of what I do in my life, professionally, personally, understanding human development. And this actually goes back into that conversation that I mentioned about NLP and what I learned. I don't actually practice NLP with my clients anymore. And it's because I came full circle with this epiphany around it's helpful as a tool to understand unconscious dynamics. But when you mess with it, it's like trying to play God with our path, like with where we're going, and thinking you know the right programs to support retraining somebody for their life. I think there's a lot of hubris in that. So I personally have backed away from that practice for that reason. Now, getting into human development, that's one of the things that fascinated me and actually was really useful about what I learned in that program, is that, as the video by Gabor Mate, by the way, he's talking about implicit memory and how impactful the early years are. We were talking earlier in this conversation about implicit versus explicit memory and how I talked about Christmas morning, and I have the words to describe. Oh yeah, I got a video game console that I'd been wanting all year. I was so excited about it, and that's the emotion that's underneath those words. And I showed body language, which is an implicit level of memory, as I'm displaying that excitement, right? And underneath that, the sensations, and you only get the tip of the iceberg of the sensations, your breathing and your movement patterns. They all imply the root, you might say, of that memory. Anyway, as children, we don't have the ability to encode explicit memory.
Right. That's what I was wanting to get into.
Oh my goodness. So the majority of that powerful time period,
the RAM is devoted to something else.
Yeah, the tens of thousands of neurons per second that are turning over. We used to think babies were blank slates. It is so not true. They are soaking in like sponges at an astounding rate through body language exchange. Is it a safe exchange? If it's not a safe exchange, like
learning language.
Yeah.
To pre-language.
Yeah, so you're learning associations that eventually will form words as you learn language, but you're learning so much more before that. And this is why a lot of our behaviors are actually rooted in our pre-verbal experience because of the rate of turnover of neurons. And so our environment with our caregivers is really, really important. You could boil that down to, we need to support communities, families, couples that have children, mothers, ultimately to that infant, bringing it all the way down to how that infant is being raised. Their environment matters a lot. We could change our environment, our world, in a profoundly positive way by establishing practices that support healthy child upbringing. It would radically change our world. All of the political unrest, all of the addiction, all of the criminal behavior.
Male violence.
We're not talking about symptoms. We're talking about the sources of issues. And the video specifically brings out the addictive patterns that are established way back before we ever choose it.
Yes. And before we are tempted to go into blaming parents, they implicitly learned that from their parents, and so on and so forth. Usually it's not a conscious negative thing.
And it's not always it's not child abuse. It could be very simply, there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
And who knows why we are created to have this experience of kind of, I'd say we're raised up in a cacophony of human experience that we just have no idea how to contextualize. The people around us then are supposed to help us get that first step, and then we're kind of, as adults, we're in a place of going, what is this really? And I think that there's different phases of that where I think we have to throw out a lot of the old stuff that we thought was real because we were told it was this way, but those explanations were overly simplistic.
Yeah.
They can't be full.
Yeah.
I wanted to slow things down. I think we're firing on all cylinders. No, I'm because so many things we could go on and on. What it seems to be that we're saying is, because it is implicit memory being formed in those times, and all of that extraordinary amount of input is being solely devoted to that. It's what Emanuel Swedenborg calls the remains, right? He has that same idea. Because of that, the one thing that isn't able to be formed, because the logos hasn't, those conscious, explicit memory building tools, what's missing is a methodology. And so society provides, just like the womb with a view for that marsupial, humans are born into a world where the methodology for how that input is framed and when it comes has to come from the outside, especially in those early phases. Filtered in through ritual patterns in society, through science and education, through parenting and parental structures, so that implicit mythos can turn around and form an explicit methodology for how it is going to absorb things in the future, which would be a labyrinth, right? With a golden thread heading toward the center that can be traced. That's a methodology. It's an explicit methodology laid out before you that forms a structure that you can fill with this data, this input data that is pouring in.
One of the things that Jackie shared on the show last week was she was saying that, when she introduces people to Labyrinth, she'll often tell them, I can tell you how I walk this, but you're going to have to find your own way. You can't really communicate the essence of something in certain ways. You can only communicate kind of the functions and the externals that are there. And the rest is kind of up to the person to take it the rest of the way. One of the things that I think is amazing about labyrinths for, especially in a day and age where I think there are so many rituals that people are bothered by. I know in my experience, there's a lot of people who I talk to who would never step foot in a church. And as a pastor, it's like, well, I can come to you a lot, but it's also nice if somebody can come to church too.
It was pretty efficient to have people come to the minister with it. House calls
you get great. More of them at once when they're all.
Why don't we create a hospital with that?
But there are a lot of people who would just go, "Oh man, I'd be struck dead," and they say that as a joke, but there's something there for them that blocks them. That they don't see that as the space, the safe space where they can work through the experiences that they need to work through. The labyrinth being almost unclaimed by anyone faith and almost untainted by who knows about it at this point.
Right.
So we can imbue the labyrinth, and that's what we do when we create rituals with the labyrinth. We imbue it with meaning. It's there, and you can see it because the symbol itself holds so much meaning. But then we add our own as we walk it, as we create rituals around it. And I think that makes it such a fantastic tool for right now in our world where we all have our hang-ups for various different reasons, the things that get in the way. Maybe just that this is a weird thing that we don't know is
the
okay.
Newness of it, yeah.
It's okay to go, well, nobody's said anything bad about it either. So we can give it a try. And that's really where I'm at. I'm 8 months into my labyrinth journey in earnest. And so in some ways, I'm just giving it a try, and I'm diving in as much as I can. But that's what I'm encouraging others to do is give it a try. Like, this has the potential to help a lot of issues and people and relationships and communities, and it's so simple.
I love the potential it has to bring communities together. So the individual healing process and the community healing process, as we all share our experiences and insights that come up through this process, it has such great potential to be a community hub. Whether we go to the same labyrinth or not, if we just share our experiences online from across the world going to different labyrinths, and what I had internally in my implicit memory when I walked in and when I walked out of that labyrinth, I guarantee you is different from beginning to end. There's an, if I may, an alchemical process. I don't know if I'm using that word right, but it's this experience of transformation that doesn't require any knowledge. It doesn't require anything explicit. It's an implicit experience, is really what it is. You were talking about tying in the early childhood development experience to the labyrinth. In a sense, I'm seeing the journey, of a child, not only in that exchange of body language with parents, but learning to talk, learning to get up, sit up, and then stand and walk. There's this journey. It's a labyrinth experience, is really what it is. It's a journey of transformation that maybe it's a little bit more extended, and we just unraveled that labyrinth over a couple of years, and that toddler's figuring out a way to make their way into the world and learn explicit memory. And go, oh, this is what it's like to consciously make my life happen versus the remains that just happen by themselves based on our environment, based on our relationship.
And there's a bias, a logos-centric bias, whereby we are so off base when we believe that if something happened before we consciously remember it, that therefore, or if even present, if we don't explicitly remember something, that we were somehow not as present in it then, right? I mean, this is a terrible example on a physical level, but the concept of blacking out when over drinking, right?
Yeah.
Which is of course terrible for you. I still think there's a misunderstanding for most people. People rightly are afraid when they wake up and they don't remember what they did last night. They are right to fear that, but I think they're wrong to do what most people do, which is to assume that from the moment that they stop remembering what happened, they were acting like some lunatic that wasn't like themselves, wandering around, which happened later. But the point is, it's so bad, quite frankly, that it is deleting your ability to hold on to long-term memory. But you can find out the next day that you were acting just like yourself. It's just that you eventually indulged so much that it deleted back. So you could watch a video of yourself being without social faux pas, etc. So the more positive side of that is, of course, that the memories that are being formed before explicit memories are no less, and quite frankly, far more important for our well-being.
So one of the big takeaways, and I think it might be useful for us to start trying to bring things around.
Bring them full Labyrinth.
Full Labyrinth. I feel like one of the things about talking about this topic in general, it brings up the idea of how much we don't determine our starting point. I think that we talk a lot about that in society today when we see external factors that are more visible and some that are less visible that we're now more in the know of today. But there are a lot of things that I think we just don't give the mercy and the grace for each other and our own experiences of what we go through and why we go through them, and how much of it is based on things that we couldn't possibly have chosen for ourselves in certain ways. Those early implicit memories that are formed in those first 18 months in particular, but also the repetition of it without knowledge of this, there's something out of whack. We can keep on reinforcing negative patterns without knowing it for so long. And here's one of the hard parts, is that there's a duty that we have to each other in certain ways to help notice. There are certain things in my character that I don't think I would have changed, that I'm glad I have changed, if it wasn't for a person that I trusted being able to call it out in me and say, hey, Alan, is that how you really, have you thought about it this way? And there's oh man, I've had that more in my marriage than anywhere else. I've had also with siblings that I can really, good friends where, that you can have those conversations. And that goes back to the community, being able to be open and sharing with each other, having that safe space. We can create that with groups around the Labyrinth, with just, this is a sacred space where we're all working to transform a little bit at a time, to rewrite some of those memories in a more positive light.
I have an interesting example that showed up rather recently. I'm going to try and be as vague as I can in case anyone happens to be watching who was present. I don't happen to drink alcohol anymore. And it's not because I had a problem with it, but because I noticed how it was negative, it had a negative effect on my health. But being in the presence of people that were drinking, I noticed that, the lack of impulse control that can happen. It was subtle, but the things that they were willing to say that I know that they wouldn't have said if they weren't under the influence, it changed their willingness to step over lines of kindness in the spirit of let's just like let everything hang loose. And that's, letting go of inhibitions is part of the, motivation for a lot of people to drink, right? So they can feel more comfortable just not having to censor themselves. But sometimes censoring ourselves, don't say everything you think. It's not necessarily who you are, what you're thinking. It's just something that passes through. Maybe just let that one go, right? And so this experience of this consistent, over a couple of hours, these friends saying things, and I'm like, I know you wouldn't say that if you weren't drinking. It brings to mind the experience of so many mistakes I've made, whether I was drinking or just not having good impulse control when I was younger, ADHD type of symptoms stuff, all of that. It brings to light how valuable it is to look at what patterns we are practicing moving forward in our lives. What are our habits now? Which includes not just exercise or diet or sleep or some of the more obvious things, but what are my mental habits? What things am I noticing come into my mind and then I'm going ahead and expressing? Am I looking at that and going, this is going to help my life move forward in some way? If you analyze every moment, you're going to go insane. But to some degree, if you can have some awareness of what are my habits of how I express myself? Am I thinking in terms of, is this kind? Is it necessary? I forget what that laundry list of questions is that people ask themselves. Is it appropriate? Is it kind? Is it necessary? Or something like that.
I think the one I like to use is it true? Is it kind? Is it loving?
Thank you. Yes, that's exactly what I was looking for. And so that type of filter is a kind of mental habit that creates a greater likelihood that we'll be connected to ourselves and one another because we're not breaching boundaries, because we're recognizing, is it true? Is it kind? Is it, what were the word? Loving?
True, kind, and loving.
True, kind, and loving. Yeah. If it passes through those filters, it's more likely to bridge connection, understanding, mutuality, creativity, all the things that we love about being human, right? And so this idea of looking at what implicit pathways in my neurology am I laying out based on my habits? You can very powerfully affect your future in a way where we didn't have control of that when we were kids. We didn't have control of our environment. We didn't have much explicit awareness or sense of how things would affect our future. But we can live in the present now as adults with a lot more discernment. There's just such power in that.
Yeah. I winding things down. I think the idea that implicit and explicit became the theme of this. I want to tie things to my realm of mythology, and some people would be more uncomfortable than others about me having a mythological approach to the Christian Bible, for instance. But very interesting, again, Emanuel Swedenborg specifically talks about the first 11 and a half chapters of Genesis as being decidedly different, have a very different quality that people implicitly see and understand. They are far more mythological, even if you don't believe in a literal or historical Bible, everything happening in it being something that actually happened in history. I certainly don't believe that. But even still, there's something different and far more mythological about the stories of Genesis, like the Adam and Eve, the
Tower
Garden
of Babel,
Noah and the flood, Tower of Babel. These are things that Joseph Campbell and Jungian psychology would immediately jump into as saying, well, we can look at Enkidu, we can look at the Gilgamesh, we can look at all these examples that are predate or come after, that are beyond similar in this comparative mythological sense. Now,
the Bible itself does that in talking about Adam in the epistles, for instance. Very much identifies Adam as a mythological Adam.
Right, this mythological prehistory, I would argue, Swedenborg talks about that as being because it was from an ancient word, which whether that is a literal ancient word or for this earlier primordial people. But the point is that is implicit memory formation. When all that data was going into building remains for the race, for the human race, right? For existence on a microcosm, on an individual level, and as a group. so that these are mythological motifs being played out again and again to form a basis. They aren't meant to be explicitly studied and understood in some literal fashion. They are about creating this deeply important set of remains for the collective.
It's funny how much this relates to exactly what I was teaching my 4th grade religion class today. I've been focused very heavily on what's the difference between rules and routines. And I'm trying to help them, and we're studying the book of Judges, which is a gory, terrible book to be teaching 4th graders, but it's awesome for this reason. When you think about judges being the ones that are enforcing the rules and the ones that are saying this is what's going, then we talk about, okay, we can create rules that make society run the way we want them to. And if we prioritize this rule and say this is the most important rule, then what happens? And that's the story of a judge. If we prioritize you shall not murder and to the detriment of some of these other commandments, for instance, what happens? Well, you have nobody murdering, but everybody can steal. And, there's other stuff that gets less important. So I'm trying to introduce the idea of, well, what's the general gist of this book? Well, it's if they follow God, then they aren't going to have any problems. When they turn away, then there's a group that comes and enslaves them, and they're oppressed until they cry out and say, please help us. And then the Lord raises up a judge to say, here's some help. So we can keep on raising up new rules and new sets of rules and new sets of rules. And I think that's what we try to do as adults in society. Here's the new sets of rules that are going to work.
Or as teachers, right?
Or as teachers. Whereas what I'm trying to explain is, what if we create routines that will enable us to behave in the ways that we actually want? We might need some rules here and there, but what if our routine is we're going to come in, we're going to be silent for a minute, we're going to say a prayer, and then we're going to go get our work and set it up, and we create this so we know the routine of what we're going to do every day. Then we aren't going to have a rule of no yelling. Well, why is anybody yelling in this moment? Our routine is this. So if we're all collectively building this routine and following it together, it creates a different circumstance than here's the rules we have to go. We need both. We need rules and we need, but it's so funny. Yeah.
It may be pertinent to point out that rules, in the context that you just mentioned them, are neurologically very costly.
Yeah.
It costs a lot of brain energy.
Yeah.
Whereas routines, they're not very costly at all because we don't think about it. It's implicitly ingrained as something we have practiced enough where we don't think about it, we just do it. And then our brain power, that precious brain power, is free for focusing on other things. And this is one of the wonderful things about building skills from a foundational level and then the next level and then the next. Like learning to ride a bike, you need to balance, you need to steer, you need to pedal. Those are 3 different skills you need to put together. And once you do that, you can ride a bike, right? But what if you want to ride next to somebody else and you want to talk to them? And you're turning your head. Well, you're not focusing on what you're doing. You have to have that implicit memory of being able to ride the bike and steer. Otherwise, you'll fall as soon as you turn your head, as soon as you focus on something else. Or maybe you're learning, pogo on it like a BMX rider. It's like there are these different layers of implicit memory we build with different skills. And so these routines are critical so that we can free up the brain power to be the best versions of ourselves.
Or even to be able to walk and talk at the same time.
Yeah.
But you can't do it first, when you see a child tasting food and it's clear that they can't control their face because the input on the mouth is all they can focus on, right? That's what they're focusing on right now. And just to bring things full labyrinth once more, bringing it back to this idea of walking a labyrinth. Anyone who knows anything about labyrinths would say there are no rules for walking a labyrinth, but we can have routines. This is my routine, rituals. This is my routine for walking a labyrinth, and it's going to make it more and more and more powerful for finding the forms of transformation that I want to get out of it.
And I think the more we do it, the routine, it's going to reinforce the positive things. Well, thank you guys very much for another enlightening conversation. And I hope that everybody here has enjoyed it. For everyone at Golden Thread Podcast, we do hope that you share, that you like and subscribe, and we're going to keep on doing this, and hope that you enjoy it. So for Dylan and Mike, have a good one.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.